Well, I know we don't have a big group tonight. Maybe a few people will join us, but thank you for coming. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Brandon Chapman. And I just tell you a little bit, and some of you know I've been the anthropology professor here for years and years, and I was so happy when we were able to bring Brandon in and learn all the new things that are going on. Brandon has a wonderful background. His research started in Trinidad, Peru, and when he came here, he gave us this fascinating talk about Easter Island. So we should have you back to talk about that sometime. He's been in northern Alaska studying, working with the Inupiaq people and other Alaska Native groups, and then he came to Ketchikan, and he's been traveling in Russia and doing research there for several years. So he really adds a lot to the anthropology, social sciences of the University of Alaska Southeast, and of course to Ketchikan. So tonight he's going to give us a talk about some of his most recent research, and thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming out and braving the little smaller ones we've had this evening compared to the previous couple nights. So we woke up to a tree down in our yard this morning, so that wasn't too fun. I'm Brandon Chapman, as Priscilla said. The joke is this is my 5th year here now, and I had been in what was Priscilla's old faculty job, and so they had called me the new Priscilla. I think after 5 years I may be the old Priscilla.
And then I said, but I'm not that old.
The longer I stay here, I'll be called that, I suppose, eventually. So, but thank you for coming out here. So the title of my talk, before I start I just want to say, obviously think of questions if you have them, please, because these go much better, especially as discussions after I speak, and obviously allows for a lot more fun, a lot more interaction. And so please, if you have questions, think of them, write them down, and we'll talk after I talk. So, title of the talk, Sami po sabi, on their own. You could also translate that to by ourselves. Support for an acceptance of Putin in Russia. So I'm going to be talking about how culture, historical experience of Russians influences political attitudes towards government politicians, including Vladimir Putin in the current day. I've done research on this over the past year and a half or so. I actually did an Ask UAS back in March. On this, I actually see a few familiar faces that were at that talk, so thanks for coming back. And so I had a lot during that talk, and I didn't get to the stuff that we're going to get to tonight. Essentially, I talked about the 1990s, which was a major transition time, the transition era, they call it, for Russia. Basically, a time where after the Soviet Union collapsed, authoritarian socialist state, of course. Basically, it was a very hard set of changes towards a more free market, democratic type of political and economic system. And so these are major changes for any people to go through a fairly short period of time. And so we're going to talk about that and talk about, again, how that sort of affects Russians' attitudes and perceptions of politics today. So I'm not going to talk to you about shoes or slippers, but I'll be talking to you about Russian politics. I show this picture because this is sort of a typical scene, winter scene, sort of outdoor market you will find in Russia or the former Soviet states. And so it's sort of speaks to, I like to have these pictures of, sort of outdoor markets or indoor markets because it shows kind of people's disillusion with what became the free market system after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so that's still on Russians' minds today, and so it kind of goes with the themes that we're going to talk about. So get my clicker working here. So, there we go. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank my wife, who is actually in the audience here tonight, Julia Sapelkina. She's Russian from Rostov-on-Don, which is one of the major cities in southern Russia, about a 2-hour flight south of Moskva. This is us in Red Square, of course. This is the famous, tourist sort of shot with the Kremlin there on the right. And anyway, she's moved to Ketchikan recently, and she's actually here in the audience tonight. She's been very much, an advisor for this research, obviously. Coming from the area, and also partial translator for some of the surveys, other research that she's helped with. So I just wanted to mention her. Maybe you'll have questions later. So we're going to be talking about politicians, including, of course, Vladimir Putin. Here is Vladimir with his prime minister, former president Dmitry Medvedev on the left there, and that's god-awful blue suit. And Putin there, of course, most people know, as has been in power since August of '99. So almost 20 years now. There was a break, 2008 to 2012, a 4-year break where Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the prime minister, was president. Basically, they had a backroom deal where after a couple terms, Putin had served them out. Constitutionally, he couldn't be in power anymore, so they made Dmitry Medvedev president, and then they basically switched back, and Putin was elected, quote unquote, in 2012. They changed the constitution to where now they have 6-year terms for president. So if you did not see, there was just a election this year, 2018. Again, we put election in quotes because free and fair they are not, according to many outside observers and most of the rest of the world. We'll talk about that a little bit too. I also like this picture too, the walking through the Kremlin, because we have one of the deacons of the Russian Orthodox Church here. And, you know, we look at Russia as basically a semi-authoritarian or authoritarian state, right? We have a leader that is recognized internationally as having ordered the killing of dissident journalists and political dissidents. You can go and walk around Moscow even today and see the areas where the memorials to a lot of the dissidents that have been killed. And so he certainly runs, again, a semi-authoritarian or authoritarian sort of state. But authoritarian states come in different flavors across the globe. Russia is very much, even though Vladimir Putin himself may not be religious or preach religiosity, the Russian Orthodox Church is very, very important for Russians in generally in the country. Actually, if you polling data will show you that Russians are one of the most religious people, meaning they consistently rate religion as very important in their lives, in their daily lives. So anyway, sort of like this picture because it shows, sort of the nature of the regime, that it's, Putin himself may not, explicitly talk about religion, but religion is a sort of integrated in some ways with the nation state there and with Putin's leadership. Putin is also very short. If you did not, little joke, but this is him, of course, with another. We talk about authoritarians, Bashar al-Assad. The conflict in Syria, of course, over the past few years. And so Putin has, you've probably seen it in the news, basically has tried, essentially, the Putin regime has tried to set up Syria as kind of a client state, essentially. They've been basically playing the side with Assad in the civil war there and being on their side, essentially, and essentially trying to create keep him in power and basically create sort of a client state situation there. So we see him shaking hands with Bashar al-Assad, who is, we talk about Soviet history, we talk about other forms of history here, not the brightest subjects to talk about, but 500,000 dead estimated in the Syrian civil war, so this is obviously very serious stuff. And Mohammed bin Salman, more recently, Saudi Arabian crown prince, shaking hands here with him. We talk about again, whether semi-dictator, semi-authoritarian state. Obviously, bin Salman, leader there in Saudi Arabia. And so, and again, we see Putin is not the tallest in the world either. So, here, bin Salman towering over him. But again, authoritarians having relationships together. I don't know if you saw the G20 summit, things that went on there recently. A lot of authoritarians getting together there, including the high five, between bin Salman and Putin, which is, maybe some older folks in the audience can help me with this one. UN meetings, G20, these sorts of things. I have not seen authoritarian leaders act out like that in sort of a congratulatory manner so blatantly at a major world leader meeting like that. Honestly, as an American, it's one of the things that I've rarely been that disgusted by, something like that. A very open showing of Vladimir Putin, who again has many names of dead on his hands, literally, and bin Salman, who recently, of course, it's our intelligence agencies have basically found without much of a doubt that he directly ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, resident journalist, originally from Saudi Arabia in the U.S. So the point is, So we have an authoritarian leader like Putin. What can anthropology, social science tell us about that? Well, we want to, why are authoritarians still in power? That's kind of the big question, right? Because, they have these sort of negatives about them. Obviously, they repress people, they, kill their opponents, they oppress their opponents. We want to explain sort of why they remain in power, and of course they have to have the, in some ways, many times, the support of the people to do that. So those are some of the things we're gonna talk about. And so you look at Russia, and of course here this is the Soviet Union, Russia included, on the eve of collapse, 1989. Russia in the pink here, of course, and then the various satellite states in the other associated colors. And so you look at the Russian population today, and much of it is actually 45 and older, what we would call middle-aged and elderly. 141 million total population in Russia, okay? And about 49% of that is above 45 years of age. So basically half of the population is, again, what we would call sort of middle-aged and elderly. It is actually a population that's been sort of steady and even on the decline as far as just total population. It's one of the few states in the world that's actually declined in population since the 1990s because of a lot of the various economic problems that have been occurring. And so we look at the people that are running the country essentially today. Those that are basically running the country. We have, again, those 45 and older folks. This is certainly something that's on the mind of those people, right? The Soviet Union. That was, they were young people, many of them older, were adults at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Those that are now in their 60s and 50s and 60s. And so obviously the Soviet Union was a great world power, spanning a third of the earth, a huge geopolitical power, of course. It could move geopolitical actors on the world stage. And, with all of its contradictions internally, we can look at the positives and negatives of the Soviet times. I just want to sort of summarize it here before we go into current stuff. 1917, of course, was the Soviet Revolution, and for nearly 75 years, basically almost all of the 20th century, it legitimately lifted hundreds of millions of people into a middle-class lifestyle. From an agrarian nation early in the 20th century, gave people an apartment, salary, even vacation time, benefits, that sort of thing. Not necessarily middle class to our level, divided by a third or a fourth, as far as total wealth, but still, hundreds of millions of people lifted, in a sense, out of poverty. Large industrialization during that time as well. But of course, there were the cons, and the major negatives, which were, of course, the estimates anywhere 60 to 20 million dead by the hands of the Soviet state through famines, genocide, gulag labor, a lot of various horrible things. So, but this is still something, obviously, on the minds of Russians today. The Soviet times. Do they look back at this as a good thing, as a bad thing? What are their opinions about it? Okay, so that's what we're going to sort of talk about. And then, post-August of 91 in Russia, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union came at other times from 89 to 91 throughout the Soviet world. In August of 91 in Russia, we have the collapse, and then it basically forms into what is today called the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS, which is essentially the formation of these various states post-Soviet times, okay? And so in the 90s, after the collapse, we had a rapid, and I mean rapid, change. Imagine, the analogy of like if your politics and your economy are a car, imagine slamming on the brakes and, doing a 180 and driving 90 miles an hour the other way. Going from what was under Soviet times an authoritarian one-party socialist state where the government owned everything, and I mean everything, to, within just literally a few months to a few years, democratic elections politically, and essentially what was close to a free market type of economy. Very rapid, okay? One of the biggest large-scale changes of any society in human history. Many Russian historians would argue that. I would certainly agree with that. So again, we would think that the current middle-aged and elderly that constitute much of the population, this would be something obviously on the mind of people, right? Today, when they're thinking about politics. Well, remember back in the 90s when this happened. Remember back in the Soviet times when this happened. These are major, again, humongous, large-scale changes. just to give you an idea, at the start of, we're going back to the Soviet times here really quick, just rural areas, for example, collectivization. This was basically at the time of the start of Stalin's rule after Lenin's stroke in the 1920s. And basically at that time in the 1920s, in the rural areas of Russia, people were basically operating their farms in sort of sort of like a free market sort of economy. Eventually this stops with collectivization. The establishment of state-owned and collective farms, the kolkhoz and the sovkhoz, the collective and state-owned farms, as they say in Russian, and you have here, this is just a percentage of the collectivization of the percentage of households in the rural areas through the 1920s and 1930s, and this is just an example of the major changes that occurred through the 20th century. Basically going from essentially no collective farms to essentially all collective farms within a decade-long period. Okay, the collectivization did end up causing some of the famine, and estimates are large-scale deaths off of just the collectivization alone. Okay, so we don't have time to go through all of this. Soviet history is very long. If you want to read 900 to 1,000-page books, there are plenty on the subject. I can recommend a lot. But anyway, the point is large-scale changes. Okay, through the 20th century. These are just some of the estimates. Again, just going off of some of the studies here that have been done. This estimates about 5.2 million total. Through various means, through exiles to labor camps, through the Gulag labor, executions, political enemies from that were enemies of the Russian state or were deemed such. Famine deaths, 2.8 to 3 million. That's the Holodomor, what they call that in Ukraine. That happened during the early 30s during collectivization. Okay, one of the worst famines in human history, and collectivization along with that separately in Russia as well. And so that's just just to give you some idea here again of the major impacts on society that the Soviet era had. So basically, just an overview of that time. Again, it increased productivity and living standards to what we would call second world levels, or something close to middle class lifestyle for many people. But if you were an enemy of the state or otherwise, you had problems, major problems, possibly even death, mass casualties. It was one of the hardest authoritarian states outside of Mao's China, again in recent history. It is not an exaggeration to say. This has certainly been my own experience. Traveling through Russia, traveling through Ukraine, other parts of what it was the Soviet Union. Most people, you will find at least one person in their family line was touched by the gulags, the famine, the genocide, something like that. Okay, and some people have much of their family tree that was unfortunately decimated by this. So again, we talk about what Russians think about today. We have to keep some of these large-scale things in mind. It would seem at least. Now we talk about the 90s. Well, okay, so just to give you an idea, GDP through the 20th century goes up. Okay, that's the increase in living standards of the Soviet Union. Okay, we see that. Like everything else, we see the big dip. Okay, the 90s is a huge dip. Every single measure that you can imagine, the 90s is a dip. Economics, living standards, those sorts of things. Life expectancy, population growth, all those sorts of things. So this is just an idea here. So the 90s comes, and okay, there's maybe a little bit of optimism after the Soviet Union, right? But then we get these major problems too. And again, a rapid change to a democratic, essentially a much more democratic system and a much more market-based economy. You can look at per capita income, national income. This is in euros, and again, 80s to current day. The 90s is that big dip down. Okay, so major problems there. Again, so the 90s, becomes somehow maybe in the minds of Russians as bad as the Soviet times. This gets pretty bad here too. Just some other numbers, I won't bore you with this too much, but it just shows you GDP, industrial output, employment, and this is through the 90s, and it all goes down. You see, basically any indicator you look at is just a humongous dip, basically through all of the 90s. So then, this is one repeat from my last talk in March. August of 91, Boris Yeltsin climbs atop and gives a speech, and this is then the collapse of the Soviet Union, essentially. And Boris Yeltsin, of course, succeeds Mikhail Gorbachev as leader of Russia, what becomes then, at that point, a semi-independent Russia. So, coming out of the Soviet Union, first of all, Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, if you ask Russians today what they think about both of them, we think of Mikhail Gorbachev, in the West as kind of the hero, that in some ways, that kind of westernized Russia and brought them into the rest of the world, at least for a time. He is one of the most despised politicians in Russian history, if you poll Russians today. Boris Yeltsin is even worse. I've read a lot of polling data on a lot of leaders in a lot of countries, and I can tell you Boris Yeltsin is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, rated by any national population of any leader in recent history. 5%, 6% approval for Boris Yeltsin. It is not an exaggeration to say, and this comes out in the surveys that I've done as well, it is not an exaggeration to say that a lot of Russians would like, well, he's already dead, but they would like to maybe see him re-dead, I don't know. But it's to that level of emotion, okay? Very much a hatred because they see Gorbachev paving the way with perestroika and glasnost, the opening up, some of the liberalization that started in the 1980s under Gorbachev. Remember, this was an authoritarian state. The leader is the one that's looked to much of the time, right? And then Yeltsin, of course, extends in basically that liberalization. Now, we think, again, in a maybe stereotypical American format, we often think of this as maybe generally a good thing if we don't know too much about, what's going on in specifics. We think, well, liberalization, democracy, all of this, okay, that's maybe a good thing, but it was not a good experience for Russians, okay? And so Yeltsin and Gorbachev today are very much despised, even though in the West, we have tended to make them a little more heroes. You can see how much 8 years put on Yeltsin. This is 91, this is 99. It was not, he had some problems during the 90s, to say the least. You can even see it on him. This is August of 99, 8 years later, almost to the day, Vladimir Putin basically being put in as leader 8 years after Yeltsin and that experiment. A younger Putin, still a short Putin. So I'm going to see if I can be able to get back into Russia when I travel there again. But I should watch my mouth here. But the point is, so again, these major changes, how do they affect how Russians view current President Putin? Some other things here, I'm going to skip over some slides maybe. So we've kind of talked about some of this stuff. So basically then, August of 91 to August of 99, basically almost to the day, an 8-year period, is what we call the transition era, okay? And again, but the liberalization of the economy of politics, here's the problem though. This gets back to the title of the talk. I said, on our own, by ourselves. This is a theme that comes out when Russians talk about politics today and their recent history. The adults do. They talk about how after the Soviet collapse, that the state was no longer there to provide a job, that basically millions of us, our society, many Russians will talk about the society, not just themselves, but they'll say our society was on our own for employment, to find employment. Under the Soviet system, again, it was all state-controlled. Jobs were administered by the state, every single one. And so when the transition came, the changes came, all of a sudden, many people were out of work and just thrown out into an economy where they really did not necessarily have any experience to be looking for work on their own, that sort of thing. And so many people became, taxi drivers, just getting in their car and trying to make a living that way. It was quite a chaotic time. People will say, Russians today will talk about chaos, the chaos of the collapse and of those especially first years of the 90s. A lot of people ended up trying to import goods from, say, Turkey and those places to try to sell them in the open markets and that sort of thing. And again, this sort of more free economic sort of style. And a lot of small business, sort of informal small businesses opened up as well. So this resulted in a large, what we call informal economy, which is still there today. A lot of the, a lot of businesses not necessarily registered with government, off the books, not taxed, that sort of thing. That's a result of the 1990s. Okay. So again, a very chaotic time. Other things here, the ruble collapsed, it went on the global market. Basically Russia economically was what we call an autarky for the Soviet times, meaning that it was basically an internal economy. Nothing much went out to the global sphere. Imagine, and again, Russians today, adult Russians will tell you this, imagine, you've, as an American, maybe, you've got a good savings account, $100,000, $150,000, a few $100,000. Imagine waking up, and this is literal, over a period of days or months, weeks, I should say, and that being worth $50 or $100. Literally life savings overnight, because once the ruble went on the global market, after the Soviet collapse, it plummeted, because it was worth essentially nothing at that point. And so, major problems, that would make you a little angry, I would imagine. It makes a lot of Russian adults today still angry, obviously. Anybody would be about that sort of thing. And you can see, too, maybe about how the view of Yeltsin and Gorbachev would be influenced by such a, as an example, such a harsh thing. So millions saw their life-saving vanish overnight because of that. And so, this is a very bad thing. The current time, then, of course, Putin takes over in '99, and then has a little break, comes back after that. Yeltsin, of course, is vastly unpopular. He names Putin as his successor in August of '99. Basically, Yeltsin was so unpopular he couldn't continue as leader, and so he installs Putin, who was a youngster at that time, not so much a youngster anymore. And of course, we have sort of what has resulted then in the, my goodness, almost 20 years since then, is basically what most people have called a semi-authoritarian or authoritarian state. It's interesting, we look back at the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century, and compare it to our century now. A lot of the authoritarian states of the 20th century had a very clear ideology, right? There was communism, there was fascism. What is the Putin regime, exactly? It's not a socialist regime in any pure sense. There's not ownership of a lot of the goods and services and land and all of that. I mean, there is some, but it's not socialist. It's not really capitalist either. It's not fascist. What is it exactly? A lot of the authoritarian states of the day don't necessarily seem to have much of a clear ideology sometimes. It's much more about corruption and keeping the person in power, that sort of thing. So we'll talk about these sorts of things too. But the point is, we have an authoritarian state, and so we want to understand again why there's a good amount of support for Putin. There has been, that's gone down a little bit recently, but there's still a reasonable amount. And also acceptance of him. So why does that exist? Maybe these historical things have something to do with this. So I did some research here. Just go through this really briefly, then we'll talk about the results and spend the rest of the time talking about that. So I had a few research questions here with this. So after the transition period of the 90s, what are Russians' sort of thoughts, conceptions of politics? Do they have thoughts about socialism as a system as it existed under the Soviet Union? Now again, I'm asking people 45 and older this, that were adults during the 90s, and then many of them also, much older, 50s, 60s, 70s, have, adult memory of the Soviet times as well, okay? So that they have thoughts about that, what are their conceptions of that? We call this in anthropology cultural models, meaning a sort of, is there a shared in common understanding of these sorts of phenomena, okay? And then the other set of questions, did this then, if this does exist, if these sort of attitudes about those different systems exist among Russians, has this sort of influenced Russians' thoughts about politicians, government, Putin included today? Okay, so that's where the research that I did is coming from, and that's sort of the point of it. Just some methods here, and then we'll show you where the survey was, and then what the results are. So we did a 30 questionnaire survey online here. Administered in Russian, of course, answered in Russian. Some examples of some of the questions here. What is your opinion of socialism? What is your opinion of capitalism? Russians would call what the Soviet system was socialist. Communism, in Marxist theory, is the ideal that is sometimes not achievable. Russians know their Marxist theory. Let me tell you, we'll talk about that. Okay, very important. Obviously much different than our own education in our system. Are there advantages and disadvantages to socialism and capitalism? We asked this too. We got specific with each of the sort of comparisons. Are there advantages and disadvantages to each? So we asked folks about that. Other things here. And then the other set of questions, we did the transition period change your view of socialism and capitalism, Russian politics and politicians in the U.S.? So I mean, those are all separate, parsed out separate questions. They obviously didn't ask a question that long. Each of them were separate. But these, and this is not a full list of all the questions, but just an example of what the survey sort of asked. Okay. Other things here. So we got a sample of 67. We had to throw out a few samples of this because you get nonsense answers sometimes, some that are not internally consistent, meaning people contradict themselves. But a very high quality sample. We'll talk about it here in a little bit. This is done through an online research firm, Prime Panels. This is actually an Amazon service. Yes, social science research gets done and gets published from Amazon using this. This is actually quite a big thing. You look at the political science, economic, and some sociology journals today, and actually a lot of the published research in some of the major journals is coming from online surveys done like this. So some people laugh when they first hear about this, but actually I've found between interviews and doing this, people can be a bit more candid than they otherwise would be in person because they're not talking to somebody in a sit-down interview, you're asking them questions. So the online stuff can actually get a little more vivid language and maybe into people's more inner thoughts. Because you think about it, I've done interviews, in many different cultures, many different parts of the world. Even if you're from a different culture, you can still sort of sense if somebody's uncomfortable or maybe believes something that you're talking to. And so sometimes people will maybe hide what they really believe to an interviewer. You're sitting down right in front of them and have maybe a certain look or a certain reaction. So the online sort of research is becoming much more popular in the social sciences, and so this is me trying to bring this into anthropology, I guess. I don't know. So we did current Russian residents, and you can actually verify this by IP address, which we did. And so you can actually zoom down with Google Maps on the apartment building where they are in the old Soviet apartment buildings, like, to the respondents, like CIA level stuff, watching you. So that's kind of fun. And we did ages 45 and older. Again, we're looking for those that were adults. Of course, we don't want kids, people that were kids when the transition happened because they wouldn't have full-formed thoughts. We want adults. So 45 and older, and so that's how we did the sample. Now, if you want to get a sample from Russia, you need to get the major cities, and of course, Russia's a big country, right? Biggest country in the world. This is the breakdown by the oblast, by region, by republic here. The oblast meaning sort of regional in Russia. And so, well, here, I'll show you this one instead, population density. So this population density, most people live on the western side, right? Basically, what you have here is the Ural Mountains. Basically, if you're traveling east, Perm is kind of the start of the Urals, and then Yekaterinburg is sort of the other side of the Urals. Okay, and so most of the population is on the west side of the Ural Mountains. Okay, so the point is, you don't want a lot of people necessarily out in Siberia. You want most of them being over here. You want to represent the population when you try to get a sample like this to hopefully be fairly representative of the people you're trying to understand. Okay, so this is the sample then, the 67. The color-coded, so the purple is basically 5 and above. This is the various places, the various cities where where the sample came from. The orange is kind of 2, 3, or 4 people, and then the yellow is 1 person. Okay, and so we got a pretty decent sample. Moscow, of course, is the most by far. 16 of the 67 come from Moscow. We would expect this because Moscow is, besides St. Petersburg, it's basically 10 times in population the other cities. Moscow's huge global city. So we want that type of skew towards Moscow. So that's fine. We actually want that. St. Petersburg is the second biggest. So we got 6 from St. Petersburg, 5 from Krasnodar, and then some of the others. We'll zoom in here for those of you not too familiar with Russia, or maybe interesting for those of you that are. Basically, most of the major cities represented here. Moscow, of course, up here. Rostov-on-Don, that's Julia's city, that's down there. We got a few from there. Krasnodar down here. We got some of the what are called the Volga River cities. That would be Samara and Taliati up there. Kazan, Yekaterinburg. Oh goodness, what else? Kaliningrad, all the way over there in the little exclave, Kaliningrad, that's by the Baltic states. If you didn't know, there's a little, what they call an exclave. It's not actually connected geographically to Russia. Many people don't know that, but Kaliningrad is over there. It's a part of Russia, technically. So we got them too. In the center here, more the central part, central-southern part of Russia, Novosibirsk, Tomsk, Kemerovo, Irkutsk, getting out to the Siberian area, so we got a lot, and even all the way over, yes, Russia touches China, Vladivostok, and those places. So all the way over to the far east side of Russia as well, one of the more forgotten parts of the country, because again, it is so massive. So let's talk about this. We've got a good amount of, we got a little bit of time here left. Talk about results. I'm going to skip through this here. Let me go to a second here. So, what are Russians' opinions of sort of socialism, free market systems, these sorts of things? I show you some Soviet propaganda here. Okay, Lenin and Stalin. All right, this is again for adult or an older adult Russian today. This would be something certainly on the minds, we would think, right? About how again massive and overwhelming the Soviet state was in everyday lives of everyday people, as we talked about earlier. Some more Soviet sort of old propaganda here for you. You know, the sort of workers of the world sort of thing. And we see, and you've probably seen some of this before, maybe online or things like that. We see it's kind of blocked out there. Lenin and Stalin were everywhere, and they certainly continue to be. Okay, so first of all, and again, we're looking at results now from the survey and from the research here. And we'll mix in here some polling data from the Levada Center, which is a major polling center in Russia as well. So there is widespread, pretty high-level knowledge of Marxism among Russians today. Man, did they get educated in Marxism when they were young. You can see it today in how people talk about politics. Okay, Julia's pointing to herself saying, yeah, she did too. Mm-hmm. So there, I mean, you know, you think about our sort of education as Americans. What do we learn about politics and economics? Well, we may learn about the Constitution and our system, right? We may learn about, you know, some of our founders, right? We may, maybe even some of us are lucky learning, you know, about Adam Smith as sort of like the equivalent to Marx as far as economist or foundation of economic thinking. Russians have much more knowledge about this stuff than we do, I would say. I mean, there are numerous consistent, accurately written, and applied direct quotes from Marx that Russians will apply to these answers about politics and their history. The most famous, of course, is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. This is something that Russians know, okay? And this is the way, you know, a lot of Russians, again, in a very general sense, have thought about their political economy for some time, okay? That Marxism is what has, you know, maybe did work at some level in the past. Not necessarily that's going to work in the future and we should reapply it, but that it is something, again, that is on the mind of the people. Here's an example of this. This is some of the polling data. This is the polling data I show here is from the Levada Center. If you are a good pollster in Russia, you are being deemed a foreign agent these days. This is what the Putin regime does. If somebody is actually going out and polling and asking the people, what do you think about things? You need to register as a foreign agent. You may be working for a foreign power. We're going to make you look that way. And so the Levada Center has all this great data, but they actually have stopped operating within the past couple of years because of this. So we only have data up to 2016 in polling. So anyway, we take a look at this. Will the majority of the people in Russia, this is asking Russians, and we have a large sample, will the majority of the people in Russia be able to live without constant care and protection of the state? So this is kind of going back to that sort of Soviet mindset, perhaps, you know, measuring that. You know, how much can we live without the state, essentially, right? That's kind of what that question is getting at. Very large here, right? What we would call a large majority. 70+% consistently over the past, what, you know, 20, 25, 30 years. The majority will not be able to live without the state's care, is what many Russians are saying. Okay? This is a very high number when we compare this to other populations of the world. Russians poll about as high as you get on this type of question. Meaning, can we live independently of the state? No, we want the state there in medium and full, whatever, what have you, okay? Now again, we don't want to over stereotype here, of course. There is a lot of diversity, and we'll talk about that diversity. But we're trying to get some general trends here. Other things. Some examples of some of the quotes from the survey I did. Talking about the Soviet Union. Life in the Soviet Union was a fairy tale. We were happy. Communism is a utopia, but socialism is a very real system. Again, talking about that distinction, that specific distinction between communism as a ideal we go towards in Marxism, but socialism is very real. It was very real for us, right? It was the real world. Communism is a fairy tale. This communism is impossible. Different races, different religions, different histories of countries and peoples, okay? But again, we see, and again, the quotes here I pick are very representative of what other people say. I'm not, obviously, don't have the time to show you all the quotes. I picked the most representative ones. But this is a common theme. Russians very much know their Marxist theory, and they know how to apply it, and they know, how to apply it historically too. A small minority, there is a small minority in the country that I would say is more purely nostalgic for socialism, meaning that they would like to bring it back, if they could, okay? Or if Putin could, or that sort of thing. So there are some that are skeptical, there were good things about it, but we don't want it back, but there are some that are purely nostalgic, okay? These folks kind of say, well, yes, socialism is the best formation for humanity. Everyone used to be able to go to the seaside. We can't, or don't anymore. We don't have benefits anymore. This is a common theme. Julia can tell you this about this too. People always complain to the Russians that that we don't have time to go to the Black Sea, to the seaside anymore to enjoy our family time, to enjoy ourselves, because we're working too hard in a more market type system. Okay. Sovok, the dustbin or the dustpan, that's a Russian word that sort of translates that way. This is also something that a lot of people use, this sort of term, basically meaning sort of the dustbin of history. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Capitalism. Okay, so we talked about their thoughts on socialism a little bit. What about sort of free market systems capitalism? Man, negative views. Very negative views. Almost consistently negative views across the board. Some quotes here. Capitalism is not for Russians. We have a different mentality. Our people have always lived in a team. Talking about, again, the sort of community, the maybe socialist, that type of mindset, okay? Many negatives regarding capitalism here when you ask Russians about this stuff. Let's continue here. Dog eat dog in the West. Competition, that sort of thing, and they talk about this in negative terms. The way you sort of translate this, sometimes the translations, from language to language get a little rough. It translates sort of like human is a wolf for other humans. It is not accepted in Russia. Our people have always helped and will help each other. Okay, so again, when you ask them about the 90s, it's chaos. It's dog eat dog, we were thrown to the wolves, this sort of stuff. Very vivid language. I mean, this is not, this is very colorful, gets very emotional. You can almost feel the emotion when reading it. It's pretty consistent that way. Capitalism is rationalism and individualism. The terrible gap in the standard of living between the rich and the poor under capitalism is very humiliating of human dignity. This is unacceptable for a person. So again, certainly not many Americans' experiences of these things, but for Russians, this is a very common theme when you, again, ask these sorts of questions. Capitalism is the greatest evil of all formations. Evil of all formations? Again, vivid language, right? Not everybody uses this strong, but it's sometimes close. This is one of the more emotional ones, I would say, using the term evil. People are governed only by money and by personal enrichment. This is a major theme. Capitalism equals money equals competition equals bad. Okay. Again, we're painting a broad brush here, but this is a lot of what the responses are about. Nobody cares about anything. All is paid. Okay. Here's polling data that sort of goes along with this. I'm going to finish up then probably how's our time, Shelley? When do we want to wrap up the lecture? Probably another few minutes or?
I mean, you can go with
Okay.
15.
Okay, maybe another 10 or 15 and then we can have questions. Is that okay or
Totally
how are we doing? Okay.
Totally good.
Okay. So to go along with that, you look at some polling data that I would say my research sort of supports that's been done recently. And Russians poll really high on this too when you compare to other world populations. Look at the bottom one. Do you think it's possible to earn millions of rubles honestly nowadays in Russia? Basically, can you be a rich person and have made it honestly? 70+% are saying no consistently, historically and currently in Russia. That's very high. In other, most other countries, I mean, sometimes we'll see like 50, maybe a majority, but that's even that's somewhat rare. To see 70, basically pretty big majority saying that basically, you can't become a rich person, in any way honestly, that's very high. Okay, so Russians pull really high on this sort of answer. What is your attitude? The top one there. What is your attitude toward people in our country who are earning millions legally? Let's see. We have again. Look at the majority. Well, the plurality here in this case. Against those people, since this kind of money cannot be earned honestly. So even when you phrase it like, people that did earn this honestly, no, they're not earning it honestly. Okay. So again, hopefully it goes back. What I really liked about this research is that it did corroborate a lot of the bigger polling data that we see, the bigger, larger samples that have been done recently. And so hopefully you can see how those quotes that we, took from my survey sort of link with the sort of polling stuff that we see here. It's pretty consistent, a pretty consistent picture about what, again, Russians sort of think about these sorts of economic and political things. A few other things here. Communism is still held as an ideal, and ideal society by many, but now likely not achievable. So again, a small minority, we could call them, are purely nostalgic, but most will say, will recognize some of the benefits of the socialist Soviet system, but most will say we shouldn't go back to it. Maybe we should do, Putin's okay, or maybe we should do something else. Okay, so that's kind of where a lot of Russians generally seem to be. Current Russian politics then. We should say here too, talk about the diversity for a second. One of the things that best predicts whether people have sort of a positive view of free markets or that sort of, and democracy, sort of more our Western style sort of political economy. One of the things that just predicts that you would logically think it is that those people that are already Westernized in their early education, people that learn English, people that come from families that have Western connections, to the United States and other countries, that sort of thing. So that's what we see here a little bit too. So that's kind of logical. So there is some parts of the population that are, supportive of Western political economy, but it's certainly not a large percentage necessarily. Understand too, I talk about, and I titled this talk, the subtitle was Support and Acceptance of Putin, right? We look at polling data on Putin today, it's gone down a little bit recently, but over the past, basically over most of his rule, it's been, reasonably strong support or at least some sort of acceptance of him. And what I'm saying here, the argument I'm making is that, and what I say in my research shows, is that middle-aged and older Russians have seen the near complete failure of pretty much near opposite ends of the spectrum. They've seen the failure in their lifetime of the collapse of a authoritarian socialist state, and they've seen the failure of a more, again, free market, democratic sort of system. And so the question then becomes, well, we may have this leader that we don't necessarily like in some ways, but how do we replace that, given that this has happened in our lifetime, and we remember that, and we have memory of it, and we talk about it, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of the bigger argument here. There is deep and entrenched operational doubt about future chances regarding the political economy, meaning that if Putin goes, is there anything better? Given what we've been through, what can we do? That sort of thing, okay? Some scenes from daily Russian life here. So to summarize, and then we'll take questions. I'll stop here. So what the results are saying is, people will talk about the advantages of socialism, but it has too much baggage. We can't go back to that. Most people will say that. Capitalism, then, the free market system, democracy, pure democracy, resulted in rapid collapse and weakening of Russia on the world stage. Okay? This is another big thing. The 90s removed Russia from the geopolitical stage, right? They all of a sudden became weak, quote unquote. They were not a geopolitical actor that could make a big difference in the world. And so this is something that comes out in the surveys too. People are very bitter about this, okay? They want strength. Putin provides strength in some ways, right? This is one of the things that was one of his political promises. Sort of strengthen the world, Crimea, taking of that and all that sort of stuff. Trying to remake what was previously a larger empire. And there is no majority or widespread agreement on what could replace Putin, or the current autocracy or kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is a corrupt state. So I'll sort of end with this. You can ask Russians today, and they will thoroughly outlay the corruption in their society for you. Russia is one of the more propagandized and just operationally corrupt large states in the world. Just in operational terms, the bureaucracy, getting things done, you have to pay bribes, corruption at many levels of government, okay? Again, we call this a kleptocracy in political science and social science. Despite that, and they'll talk about Putin too. They'll talk about his corruption. They'll talk about even, understand that he has killed dissidents. Yet there is this plurality of support, and there is this, in some ways, acceptance of him too. And so again, I'm arguing that this is because of the historical experiences. And people will say, well, what to replace it with? Well, some people will say, okay, China's got a one-party, China's got their model. The Northern Europeans have their model. It's interesting though that they don't talk about Russian historical examples much, because again of the previous failures. So when you ask people about, well, if you don't want Putin, what should we generally replace that with, or what should be in place of that? They'll constantly go to other world examples, not to their own historical examples. Okay. So anyway, I think we'll stop there. I was gonna let me show you one more thing here. Where was it? It was about Putin. Oh, where is it? I forgot now. There we go. We'll end with this. So get back to our friend Vladimir. How would you describe your feelings toward Vladimir Putin? Recent data on this, polling data. So a lot of different things here. Let me try to highlight the big ones. There are two major categories you see up here. These two, right? They get the big numbers. They either like him or they can't say anything bad about him. Which is, again, what I would call passive acceptance. So we're not going to fully support him. We know he's corrupt. We know the government's corrupt, but we can't say anything bad about him. We'll let him stay because there's nothing better. Because we've had failed systems before. We've seen major failures before. So. Spasibo. Thank you. Let's have fun with questions, please. And yes, at the gates of the Kremlin there. I'll just like to take photos at the political points. Yes?
Well, what about the people under 30? You must have met some of them. Or 30 when you were there last. What do they want?
Well, that's, I don't know if from this research, I can answer that. I mean, formally from the research, because we did look at 45 and older. The youth of today, I'm not sure if I can answer that fully. I certainly perceive that there's a mix, obviously, like there is, but how much are they how much are they anti-Putin? How much are they pro-Putin? I'm sorry, I don't mean to avoid the question, but I can't. It would be hard for me to say. My research didn't cover the younger generation.
I realize
so
that's a different thing. But what about?
Sure.
I mean, there seems to be a lot of immigration, Russian younger people coming here.
There has been an increase of generally of Russians and those from the former Soviet world coming to the U.S. Over the past couple decades. Yes. But a lot of the times those folks are already a bit westernized already, meaning they've learned English from in their schooling, that they have maybe connections already with family that are already here, that sort of thing. We have pretty major enclaves in Florida, New York, of pretty large Russian populations and Soviet world populations. So there is that part of now. How much does that affect? Again, looking at under 30 and the youth, this is a good question. I'm sorry I can't necessarily answer that, but don't underestimate the power of authoritarianism in this current world. A lot of people have the stereotype that the young generation. People have talked about this in our our analysis in the United States about Iran, like the younger generation in Iran is going to be revolutionized and become Western and all this sort of stuff. Didn't necessarily happen. I wouldn't necessarily. An argument that I'm making here is that again, there's a lot of it's not necessarily active support, but it's passive acceptance. And I would say that that's probably going to continue even into parts of the younger generation. I would say. Understand that Russia is one of the most propagandized states in the world. the television networks, the media, it is basically Putin run, Putin operated. The stuff that's reported on there comes from the Putin government. RT, Russia Today, has their America outlet, their Washington D.C. outlet. You can go find it on YouTube, find some interesting things. But that's going to have a huge effect. We can see the media effects playing out in our own society these days, certainly. Tribal media sort of things. And so media is always one of the major influences of political thought in any society, especially in Russia too, because of the level of propaganda. So I would say the youth, I'd like to be idealistic as far as being against Putin, but I wouldn't. I go from mildly cynical to hyper cynical, and those are my two levels right now on a lot of things. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to have a lot of good news for folks, but I would say that's the way to look at it. The propaganda state is going to have a huge effect, and we'll continue to have that.
I think it was Fortune had an article a couple months ago about how so many countries with authoritarian type political leaders, and in many cases they're popular.
Yeah, because they control the media.
Yeah.
The media is again one of the big, one of the 2 or 3 biggest effects of political opinion anywhere. Yeah. Excellent questions. Yeah.
I have a question first, actually, if you don't mind. I want to provide a comment on that.
Of course. Yeah.
I used to live and work in Lithuania, former Soviet Republic, and just to share my personal experience, I was mostly doing minority voting research. But what I found unique about Russian youth, about Eastern European youth, in general, they were all over the place. Some love Putin, a lot of them don't like Putin. But what was unique were the people, especially who were non-ethnic Russians, who told me that they believed they deserved Putin, but they did not like him. So that was an interesting third path.
Yeah.
Jumping to my actual question, so it's a two-parter. I noticed that you didn't have any polling outside of Russia. Now,
This is purely about Russia, yes.
Exactly.
And then not about because there's so much diversity. You go to Ukraine and Georgia, the dissident states,
Right.
Right. You could go on and on. Yeah.
Right. So I was kind of gonna get on your side here and say, if you had gone and talked to people in Eastern Europe, in
Right.
America,
It could be a
Right.
lot.
It would've been a lot.
Ukraine and Georgia especially would be completely the opposite.
right.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I think you would have found that you pretty much had this essentially the same information, just on a larger scale. But had you done that, what do you think you would have found? Do you think
If
you found
this had
anything-
been a wider
Right.
former Soviet state
Or
research.
former Soviet state, I was thinking more specifically expat Russians.
Okay.
So especially, in the former Soviet states and in Western countries.
To the other Soviet states, again, you would have a large diversity. For those that are not maybe familiar with the other states besides Russia, of course, most of us are familiar with Russia the most. Ukraine and Georgia, I mentioned those. Georgia to the south, Ukraine to the west, have had horrendous historical experiences with the Russian state, especially the Soviet times, and so they are. My wife and I traveled in Georgia just recently. We traveled through the Caucasus. Georgia's part of that. They've eliminated Russian language from the country, and that was one of their major second languages essentially for all of the 20th century. So you would have a completely different look, and that's why I focused on Russia here, because it's again, you would have that diversity. About expats, I think you would see a little more, slightly more perhaps pro-Western opinion. Again, that's just the nature of it. People migrating out, you would logically think that. Again, that's not what my research touches on, but I would imagine that, certainly. And certainly just from my own anecdotal experience speaking to folks like that, that's generally what you get. So I think, I don't want to go overboard, but I think you would see at least a slight uptick in that. How much, I'm not actually sure, but at least a slight increase in that sort of opinion. Yeah. But there's still, you can talk to expats that are supportive of Putin, certainly, and very nationalistic. This is a nationalist regime. Putin is. Let's say that's the most accurate term I think we could put on it, as a national. It's about the strength of the nation, and those sorts of things, and an ethnic identity in a sense. Ed.
Is there even a consensus to begin with that Russian citizens want change, at what cost, and if they want change, they don't want capitalism as a model to go after. Have they identified what it is that they want, or did they just, is there a strong enough consensus for the status quo to remain the way it is?
My argument is that don't expect Putin or anybody that succeeds him out anytime soon, because again, there is a reasonable amount of active support, and there is again this acceptance because of the historical failures of some of the other systems. There, so when you ask about, for those that do support going towards something else, what they want,
They know what they want.
well, there's not a majority. There's certainly not a majority. It goes all over the board. I mean, China has a model of something to do. A one party kind of free market type of system, kind of, but socially repressive in ways. They don't say socially repressive, but that's what China is. They talk about democratic socialism up in Northern Europe, that sort of stuff. It goes all over the board. There's absolutely no majority on what is agreed upon as sort of an alternative model. So
Maybe that's the problem, indifference.
well, it's not necessarily indifference. I wouldn't say that. I mean, look, Russians will talk, and they have deep knowledge of politics, and there are many that will talk about it, and will talk about it thoroughly. And there's a lot. I mean, I would say in many ways, Russians have more knowledge about their political history than Americans do, and very highly knowledgeable. So, but it's just again, you've been through the collapse of these two types of major entities. You would hesitate to try to take out what's currently there, even though it is in some ways bad and corrupt because of that historical experience. And that's what I'm saying is very much widely shared. It's cultural.
Right.
It's in common. People believe it. And it's palpable. It's there. And remember, 50% of the country is that 45 and older population. And so this is much of the country, and they're the ones in charge, essentially. And so I would say wait 20 years, about another generation. Then that memory of the 90s will start to fade. Then that's when you start to get that historical memory fading. We can see this in our country too, and in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. The historical memory of World War I and nationalism fades. Guess what starts to rise? Nationalism. Okay? That historical memory goes. Take about 20, 25 years, then maybe we'll start to see something anti-Putin or his successor or whatever come into play in Russian society. That's what I would say. Kathy? No?
So what was Putin's position when he was tapped by Yeltsin? I know he's the KGB,
Yeah.
right? And when he began to tidy up opponents, what was the response? What was the response within Russia? What was the response in the world?
Man, tidy up is the perfect set of words for what Putin offered and Putin did. Security! That's what Putin offered and Putin did, immediately. Security. The 90s, what happens when you have a lot of poverty all of a sudden and you have no police, you have no weak government and no police force? Mafia. That's where the Russian mafia comes from, the 90s. And so, all this crime, I mean, people will tell you, back then, in the transition era, I mean, people were getting shot on the street in the cities. It was bad. I mean, it was dangerous. People, didn't want to go out at night. This is serious stuff. And so Putin offered security. And one of the first things he did, and this is a controversial topic, but there's pretty good intelligence stuff to support it, that there were a series of apartment bombings that went on right after Putin got into power. And then this was the justification for going into Chechnya and starting what became a conflict in Chechnya that sort of galvanized support for Putin in his early days. It has been hypothesized, and I would not have put it past Putin that this may have been a planned thing as far as the apartment bombings to make this Chechen conflict start or make the justification for it. It galvanized his support, and he's been pretty well supported ever since by a lot of the public. So it was security. That was the big thing. And then also, we're going to make you a power on the world stage again. And we're going to do that by cutting other powers down. Because we don't have the power ourselves. I mean, we can't play up to the big boys necessarily, but what we can do is we can screw with your elections. We can, take little bits here and there, Crimea, that sort of thing, and try to rebuild our national identity on the world stage that way and make you proud of that. By the way, Crimea, you remember, happened in early 2014, right? We're almost 5 years, my goodness, almost 5 years from that now. The public polling, support for Putin spikes up 5, 6, 10 points after Crimea. Big spike. That's on the minds of Russians. They think that they collapsed on the geopolitical stage because it was a Western conspiracy, and that's not an exaggeration. A lot of Russians believe that. You could ask a lot of Russians today, why are they in eastern Ukraine and in the Donbass fighting there? Because the United States was going to take Ukraine.
Mhm.
Not a joke. I mean, that's, now again, I don't want to paint too broad a brush, but you could ask a lot of Russians that, and that's the level of the propaganda state. And so there is this, I hesitate to call it conspirational, conspiracy sort of level, but it gets towards that for some of the population, a good percentage of the population. And so that's a key thing here too, to understand. So you have that sort of environment. A Putin can, do okay, survive, certainly. And he's cagey, he's smart. He put himself out of power after 2 terms. This is not like sub-Saharan Africa where it's like, 30, 40 years, I'm just going to make myself world leader for life. He's saying, okay, I'm going to make this try to look legitimate, right? I'm going to put Dmitry Medvedev in power, then come back, have a little backdoor deal with him, then come back 4 years later, raise the term up to 6 years, not make myself for life, but just do little bits and pieces. And then by 2024, when the next election comes, we'll see what his scheme is, right? Maybe he'll do another little deal and come back in, or maybe he'll set up some other thing, but, So he knows, and, you have to understand this too. People often say, and actually when I was getting this research approved, through our institutional review board, where you have to get the questions approved. Are you dealing with a dangerous population? Are you, protecting people's rights, that sort of thing? When I was getting this research approved, it's kind of a common question. Well, is it safe for Russians to talk about this stuff? Like, I was doing this online survey, like, are you going to endanger anybody by asking him political questions? And I was like, of course not. Because Putin is, it's an authoritarian regime, but it's not, look, you've got to either be organizing some sort of mass protest, or be an oligarch, or be a journalist, or be a political opponent, if you're going to be in serious trouble. Otherwise, Russians will talk out, in public about their opinions about things. It's not a completely repressed society. We need to understand that too. People in cafes and restaurants, public places, will generally talk about their opinions, even if it is, corruption of the government, that sort of stuff. So this is a authoritarianism light, whatever you want to call it, semi-authoritarianism. It's not complete repression, but it is, Putin's playing a game here. It's not necessarily ideological or anything else. It's just, I want to remain in power. I want to remain a rich person on the big stage, make my country great. Here you go. So, that all makes sense. Larry had a question.
You're going to have to forgive me if I have to start with an anecdote. It's my only insight into Russia in the 90s. In the year 2000, I spent a week in Copenhagen attending a seminar on ship's engines, and a guy that I hit it off pretty good with was a Russian chief engineer. And we were talking about such things, and he said to me, and I wish I could do it, he spoke really good English with this rich accent. It was wonderful, so I can't imitate that properly. But he said, to make money in Russia, you must be a seaman or you must be a criminal. And I got a really good insight at that time, and particularly at that point in time, the Russians had moved big into the international maritime field. Anyways, so my question really is, and it's probably a little bit away from this, but I'm just curious. I said, I'm wondering if this disastrous transition time might be due to ascribing to the neoliberal transition theories as prescribed by the U.S. government, and in particular the policies advocated by the Chicago School of Economics.
So,
And I just, because when I watched this happening, I said, this is crazy. They're going in there and they are trying to change this thing literally overnight, which was the neoliberal theory thing, and it failed disastrously.
It was a liberalization of a lot of things, sure, and we could put the term neoliberal on that. That's fine, sure. It was done too rapidly. even in hindsight, the people that did it say it was done too rapidly. It was not done. So look, here, I mean, here's the major thing that happened at the transition. So Anatoly Chubais, kind of an obscure name maybe for many people that maybe not know him, he was basically the head, the designer of how to liberalize the economy after '91. And so the idea was, okay, the Soviet state owned everything, land, property, everything. How do you divide that up? I mean, how do you get that out on an open market, right? So what they did was they basically created a share system. It sounds kind of logically reasonable, right? We'll just hand out shares of things, of the state-owned companies, of the land, of everything, basically, to the people. We'll divide it up, and then that's how we'll do this. The problem is that people, I mean, the marketing wasn't good, lots of different factors. What happened was basically a handful of people bought up the shares from everybody else. And that's how you have the oligarchs of today, many of them, what are called the new Russians. The people that got rich. There are more multi-millionaires and multi-billionaires in Moscow than any other city in the world. Many people don't know that. Russia has a large, a top 1%, a top 5% that's incredibly wealthy, even though much of their population is, not necessarily at, Western European or U.S. economic levels. And so, this is seen as a very corrupt thing, and it was a very rapid transition that was not done well. It's easy to look at that in hindsight. I think Boris Yeltsin gets kind of a bad rap in some ways. This is not an easy thing to do. I mean, you're taking a basically pure socialist system and somehow trying to democratize that and liberalize it, if that can even be done, right? And so how to do that, I don't, design-wise, I'm not sure. So it is a little easy into Monday morning quarterback it, I think. And again, Yeltsin, I think it's sort of a bad rap in that sense. He was just trying to do the best he could. And I think compared to other politicians in maybe somewhat of an honest way, maybe some ways not. But yes, there was, could some other sort of system have replaced it perhaps? This is not a pure liberalization. There's still a lot of state-owned stuff, through the 90s too. But it was a partial liberalization. So yes, I would agree that there were certainly mistakes made, and the people involved with it, most of them would admit those mistakes, and certainly outsiders have gone through the mistakes in the studies and the literature since then. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, it was not done well, and you could see the results in all the indicators. The 90s is just that huge dip in everything, right? So, and people, I talked about this in March at my Ask UAS. It was hell. It was chaos. People had to grow back to the dakshas, the summer homes, and start growing crops and growing food as a supplement, because jobs were gone and you had to make it on your own. On your own sort of stuff. That's what people say. We were on our own. The state was not there anymore. We had this new system all of a sudden that we were not used to. And hopefully we can empathize with that a little bit, right? I mean, that's a complete change of a society, essentially overnight. But something had to be done, so. But not necessarily the best design. I'll give you that. And I mean, does it support like the Chicago School of like free, classical laissez-faire economics? I mean, not necessarily. This was not. I mean, there was definitely nothing pure market economy about this, but it was a pretty rapid and high liberalization within just literally in some sectors of the economy within literally just a few months. So one of the biggest and most rapid changes of a large-scale society we've seen in history. So, and the Soviet era was too. I mean, the Russians have been pulled back and forth. So, yes.
What happens to the hardware of an economy, the things that make an economy go when it collapses like that? Where does that hardware go? Does it just fall into disrepair and rust away, or?
Well, one of the major problems with the transition was that all of these things that were working internally within the internal markets of Russia suddenly got pushed to the global markets. So I mean, you have all of this stuff, you have all this productivity, all these measures we think of an economy being in the currency circulating within Russia. Now all of a sudden you open up to global commerce, global buyers, global sellers, the currency included, and it's not worth as much anymore. It's, you see what I'm saying? So I mean, this is one of the major things here that happened economically. It was just the opening up the global markets. It was no longer an autarky. It was, opened up that way. And so that's one of the major factors here. And so, I mean, the physical stuff obviously is still there. It doesn't disappear. The factories, all the industrial stuff. But how do you operate within a system that now has goods and services coming in that are, worth so much different? How do you operate with a currency that's collapsed, that's not going to buy you as much? These sorts of things. And so the industrial stuff is still there, but it becomes much harder to operate within the economy when you open it up to global markets like that. Remember, the Soviet Union, the Soviet system was around for much of the 20th century, for decades, for generations, and all of a sudden being thrown on the world market becomes a major issue. I mean, the currency, again, the collapse. Imagine your currency all of a sudden being worth 1/100th of what it was within, overnight or within a few weeks. That's what happened.
Wasn't some of the military and ships and planes sold to other countries?
That I'm sorry, I can't. That I would have to look into more. I don't know the history of the selling of some of the industrial or some of the industrial equipment at the transition. That I would have to look a little more into. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. But I can speak today about Russia's sort of military capabilities a little bit. Russia does have decent military capabilities generally, comparatively to the rest of the world. One of the problems that Crimea was 5 years ago, right? Eastern Ukraine, they've had fighters in there for a little bit. Sometimes people make the argument, well, why aren't they expanding more? Why aren't they trying to get more? It's not necessarily that they don't have the military capability, it's that they don't have the economic capability. Those things take management. And they don't have the economy right now to do that. They're still basically in some sort of recession, and so their currency's not strong. And so it would be very difficult. People always talk about, the Baltic states, well, they're going to go for Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia next. And I say that's a remote chance right now. Maybe in the future it could happen, but economically they're still pretty weak. Possibility, but I would not necessarily count on it, So I'm sorry, I can't answer the question about the.
Well, it's something
but yeah,
to
the
look
military
into or-
capability.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, does Putin, I'm wondering, does he have like a plan, or is his staff informing him well as far as, does he have a plan on what it takes to get the Russian ruble back to the value that it was before? Or does he have an understanding about finances? Is anybody?
Vladimir Putin alone cannot do that.
I know that, but I'm saying that's why
bigger
I said
economic
his
forces.
advisors,
Yeah.
is he being advised, or is he seeking advice on what it takes?
Well, sure. I mean,
No.
well, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
continuing to build the Russian economy is, of course, a major thing. Look, I mean, again, Putin turned towards the more geopolitical strength side and
Right.
cutting down other power side, especially after the economy took a turn down within the past,
Right.
5 or so years. I mean, that's why we see more meddling in the elections. It's not necessarily, okay, so Russia now has the less capability of making itself, a major power, so we're going to cut other people down, right? And so that's the meddling in the elections, all that sort of stuff, which they've been very successful at, by the way. I mean, not just here, but in parts of Europe. They've got to be patting themselves on the back as far as their plan going into this and what they've actually achieved. It's really quite remarkable, the amount of influence they've had. Whether that's swayed anything or not, that's very much a political argument and a different story, but they've certainly influenced things. That's pretty undeniable, I would say, in some ways. Yes?
Is their economy mostly based on oil right now? Is that their?
It's generally an oil-based economy. The old saying is, what have you bought from Russia recently besides oil and a matryoshka? It's they certainly need some other things to sell on the world economy. Obviously oil's a big thing, but oil's a commodity, fluctuated prices. We all know that story. So when it's down, it's like Alaska. When it's down, it goes down a little bit, even more so for them. So. I mean, they're essentially still in some form of a recession. The currency's, certainly taken a downturn over the past 5-6 years. And so that's probably going to continue at least for a little bit. Not necessarily a lot of technological development either. They could maybe do good by focusing on technology. I mean, just comparatively to other nations, you know, that would maybe be a good thing, a smart thing. They've got a lot of internet trolls. Turn the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg that's been screwing with elections, turn them to, you know, software engineering or something. Maybe they could create some new things for the internet or something positive instead of screwing with elections. So, a cheap form of labor to cut other nations down is the internet trolls and all of that. So, doesn't cost a lot of money, you know. Anyway.
Does Russia really export anything other than oil to the rest of the world?
I'd have to look at the total list, like currently. But again, it's certainly an oil-based economy. But again, there's not anything
Vodka.
fun. The cultural things, you know, that we stereotypically think of, you know, the alcohol.
Grain.
A few others. Shane?
Yeah, I remember reading an article about how there was some exploratory drilling in the north areas, but I also noticed
Above Siberia and the Arctic areas?
Yeah, maybe some pretty extreme deposits of oil. Is that?
Oh, well, I mean, there, you know, that
That
stuff's always being explored, sure. I mean, I can't speak to it, like, I mean, currently is what it's been recently, but I mean, that stuff's always currently explored just like it is anywhere else, you know. Yeah. But again, I mean, even if you get a mountain of that stuff, I mean, you still got, oil's a global commodity. It's going to fluctuate, and that's going to depend on a lot of other factors outside of just what the supply is coming out of Russia. It depends on the price. What's Saudi Arabia doing? What's, you know, the rest of the world doing with oil? So that's what determines this stuff. So not just their internal supply. Yeah.
What do they plan to do with all that space in Russia? I mean,
They've been talking about that for years.
you could fit the United States 3 times over in the area of Russia, and you got 9 different time zones across the whole continent.
Well, Russia is huge,
Yeah.
and I mean, you know, much of it is very sparsely populated.
They don't have the largest human capital, but they sure have the largest space.
I think maybe this is a good point to end on. You know, we talk about in history of politics in the world. You know, we oftentimes think of World War II in our own history. It's sort of the major things of world political history. One of the major things we should think of is the power of the Russian state. It's really quite underrated, and it's something we should think about. We think about the immensity of the Russian state, just how large it is. Think about what the Soviet Union was. And all of its horror, all of its other things, it went to all of these, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Baltics, all these vastly different cultures. Some are nomads, like in the stans of Central Asia. You've got the mountain peoples in the Caucasus. You've got the coastal peoples up in the Baltics that are more closely related to Northern Europeans. All these sorts of things. And the Soviet state represses them and brings them pretty much effectively under one roof for 3/4 of a century.
Wow.
I mean, that is a feat in itself. And not only that, even after the collapse, Russia maintains itself in most of its territory, and still you have a coherent, basically, culture there over that vast geopolitical landscape. The power of the Russian state is, in all of its goods and bads, is really something that we should marvel at, because it has been a humongous political force, and it's still politically, it punches above its weight, its economic weight all the time. Even in the Soviet days, the Soviet economy was 3 to 4, you know, divide our economy by 3 or 4 times, that's what it was. It was not necessarily that big, yet it was our rival. Now it's it's in recession, it's not necessarily even at some developing countries' economic levels, and it's still punching at our political weight. They're still our foe in a sense, right? They always punch above their economic weight, always, and that's a feat. And that's the Russian state. It's really something to marvel at. So that's my speech there at the end. So something to think about.
Time will tell.
Yeah, and that's why the state is so big in Russians' minds, right? It's about the state. It's about the power of the state. It is an immense thing, and much different way of thinking about politics than we think about politics. We're very libertarian people generally, in a very general sense. We talk a lot about how big the state, you know, smaller state, you know, essentially. That's kind of has been our general political debate for quite a long time. This is kind of another culture, another view, right? So, thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming out on a December evening.
Hi, Ruth.
Good to see you.
Spring, my father.